Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for joining this symposium on economic and environmental implications of bioenergy crops and biofuel. This AAEA 2020 has been very special to me because sustainability is what my life is all about. And we kicked off our meeting with the session on sustainability, the interface of food, agriculture, and environment. And we have been consistently talking about this nexus throughout the meeting. It was great to hear during our AEA presidential address, Dr. Dawn Tilmany McFadden talking about one of my most favorite book, The Tipping Point, by one of my best author, Gladwell. And she talked about its applications in our discipline and AAEA community, which was very encouraging. Equally encouraging was Dr. Chris Barrett's thought-provoking address on de-agrarianization and the need for combinatorial social technical bundles to overcome food security challenges and to reverse agricultural sector from sources of greenhouse gas emission to the sink of greenhouse gas emission. This symposium aligns very well with the same line of thought. So strategically placing these cellulosic bioenergy crops like switchgrass in agricultural landscape can play a significant role in supporting bioeconomy, mitigating climate change, and also generating a number of ecosystem services. In order to foster the creation of such multifunctional bioenergy landscape, it is important to have a comprehensive understanding of feedstock production system from the biophysical as well as the economic standpoint. Different land use and land cover configuration can be combined, matching the in-field variability in environmental attributes with the crops and cultivation practices to increase supply of food as well as biomass to support the bioeconomy and also enhance ecosystem services. Such ecosystem services include nutrient loss reduction, climate mitigation, increased biodiversity, and supporting pollinators and biological pest control. And such land configuration include incorporation of perennial bioenergy crops on marginal land at the edge of the field and riparian area. And it also includes cultivating cover crops, selection of type, quantity, and timing, and application of nitrogenous fertilizer, and also going low or no tillage. So while such innovative bioenergy landscape can generate feedstock for cellulosic biofuel and bioproducts without competing against food production and also generate ecosystem services, the pressing questions we have are how to identify the conditions under which farmers and forest owners would have an incentive to adopt this practice, how the regulatory frameworks drive the bioenergy system, how the opportunity costs of production plays its role, and how the transportation cost can minimize cost of feedstock production and support bioenergy value chain, right? And also what role the compensation for ecosystem services can play in willingness to grow these bioenergy crops. So we will discuss the following 4 case studies to set up the stage for discussion on the economic and environmental implications of bioenergy system in the US. We will have the presentation on each of these topics, each of these 4 topics, and followed by a discussion section. As David Letterman have in his recent program, my guests today need no introduction. You all you all know them, and I still have, if you haven't already, I will let you to be amazed by their academic accomplishments as well as their services to AAEA community and society. please read read their introduction here. Um, so, so Dr. Madhu Khanna is going to present on her work on the social cost of renewable fuel standard. Then Dr. Scott Swinton will present his work on the opportunity cost of bioenergy feedstock. That includes examples comparing the potential of conventional and bioenergy crop yields and associated environmental outcomes based on his research in Michigan and Wisconsin. Dr. Juan Cesmero will report on research examining how transportation costs are likely to shape the mix of feedstocks used by cost minimizing cellulosic biofuel plants, as well as its implication for the economic and environmental footprints. And then I will present a case study on the economics of cellulosic bioenergy crops in marginal land and associated soil carbon sequestration in Illinois. So please hold on to your questions until the end of these 4 presentations. Then we'll have this question answer session as well as a discussion. With that, I would like to invite Dr. Madhu Khanna for your presentation.
All right. Thanks, Shruti, for setting that up. Let me see if I can. All right. Okay, great. And thank you all for tuning in. I know I see a lot of familiar faces from among my collaborators who are here on the call today. So I hope you will take this opportunity to participate in the discussion after the talks are over. So this is work with a large number of co-authors in my group, as well as with collaborators at Iowa State University. And
process. This response is back.
Oh, sorry.
Oh. All right.
Okay, let's see. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry about that.
Not quite sure how to move this forward. All right. Okay. Maybe that just works. All right. So I'm sure everybody here is probably familiar with the Renewable Fuel Standard, but just very briefly, this was established in 2007 to with a mandate to produce certain levels of different types of biofuels, basically about 15 billion gallons of corn ethanol by about 2014, 2015, and 36 billion gallons and 16 billion gallons of cellulosic biofuels by 2022. One of the goals was to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also to enhance energy security, promote rural economic development. And the graph on the right shows the progress that we've made in achieving these goals. As you can see, are the goals. This shows what the RFS goals were on the left bars, and on the right is the EPA, what they actually mandated over this time period. And as you can see from here, that the corn ethanol mandate, or the conventional biofuel mandate, has largely been achieved, but the cellulosic biofuel mandate has significantly fallen behind, and we have yet to really begin large-scale, commercial production in a major way. So now the current RFS as set up was until what's set these volumes until 2022, but the mandate is likely to continue beyond that. What shape it takes is yet to be determined. And we thought this would be an opportune moment to actually look at what the implications would be of continuing the mandate beyond 2022. So we look at the time period 2016 to 2030, sort of 15 years, looking at what the implications would be of continuing the mandate for corn ethanol at the current level and of achieving the cellulosic mandate over the next 15 years. So there's been a lot of research on the implications of these biofuel mandates, and in a real quick nutshell, basically what it it shows particularly the impact of corn ethanol has been, numerous studies have shown that it has contributed to an increase in food crop prices. Studies vary in the extent to which this has happened. And there's also been a lot of research looking at how it contributes to indirect land use change by expanding cropland. Again, a lot of different estimates on how large this is. And one of the interesting things here is that as these studies have progressed since 2007, 2008, the magnitude of this impact of indirect land use change in particular have been coming down in the literature, and have, from initial studies saying that corn ethanol was worse than gasoline, more recent studies show that it's actually fairly small. There was also initially a lot of concern about the rebound effect, because it was expected that 36 billion gallons of biofuel by the US would lower oil prices, and with the US being a major importer of oil, this would lower global fuel prices and create a rebound in fuel consumption in the rest of the world, and possibly in the US, that could again make ethanol worse than gasoline. So it's been very, the impacts on greenhouse gas emissions have been questionable in the literature because of that. There's also been some work looking at the impacts of corn ethanol on creating more demand for corn and nitrate runoff and hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico. But then on the positive side, there's research showing that the mandate actually benefits the economy and increases social welfare rather than being a cost on the economy, even though it is a binding constraint, because it can improve the terms of trade for the US. And it, if it lowers fuel prices and increases the price of our exports, that can actually offset the costs of the mandate on the domestic economy. Now, there's lots of reasons to think why this impact, more recent assessments of this can actually lead to different impacts than what has been estimated by the early literature. And so part of the purpose of this paper is to look at that, but then also to look at what the implications of achieving the cellulosic mandate would be. And so just looking at the, some of the observed data, and there's a lot of, we've got sort of a paper looking at this more closely. But food prices are actually lower now than they were in 2007, or about the same effect, same level. Total crop acreage has not really increased that much, although there's been some spatial redistribution. The US, so that's on the food market side. On the fuel market side, the US is no longer an importer with the shale gas, increase. We've actually become a small price-taking exporter of petroleum products. And so the global rebound effect is expected to be, negligible. And so this suggests that both of those market-mediated impacts, which were expected to be huge, are actually unlikely to be the case now going forward. There's also been, quite a bit of research on the role of cellulosic biofuels, and these could be produced either from crop residues or from high-yielding dedicated energy crops, or forest residues and so on. Essentially anything that has a carbon intensity of 60% or lower than gasoline, and is a biomass-based feedstock. And one would expect, Shruti said that this is expected to be better than corn ethanol because there's lower competition for cropland. You can grow these on lower quality land, so its impact on food prices and land use would be smaller. They're expected to have substantially lower carbon intensity. They are energy crops, lower the nitrate runoff with relative to corn and soybeans, just because of their extensive root systems and low need for nitrogen. Although the effects of harvesting corn stover are somewhat mixed in the literature. But on the other hand, we know that they are significantly more expensive to produce, and therefore, what their economic impacts would be, needs to be examined. So in this, research, what we're trying to do is to conduct a social cost-benefit analysis of continuing this RFS, by looking at both the economic implications as well as the environmental implications, compared to a no policy scenario in which the ethanol production remained at the 2007 level. And in the environmental impacts, we want to go beyond greenhouse gas emissions to also look at the impacts due to nitrogen emissions. And so I'll talk about that in just a little bit. But we're looking at two policy scenarios: maintaining the corn ethanol mandate at 15 billion gallons with some amount of biodiesel production, and then also adding on 16 billion gallons of cellulosic ethanol by 2030. We want to also look at not only just the physical impacts on nitrogen use and greenhouse gas emissions, but monetize them so they're comparable to the cost, and we use the social cost of carbon and estimates of the environmental benefits from reducing nitrogen emissions to surface, groundwater, and coastal zones from the literature. So it's a very approximate way of doing sort of benefit transfer, applying benefit transfer approaches with obviously, first cut at trying to even estimate what the impacts are. And we also measure the fuel, what happens in the fuel markets, the domestic rebound effect, as well as the domestic indirect land use change effect. So we use a model that we've been using in the past with extensions now, so that we can with an updated transportation fuel sector that takes into account the changes in the U.S. Changing from an importer to an exporter, as well as looking at the impacts on nitrogen use and greenhouse gas emissions and so on. And this is an open economy dynamic model that determines land use allocation, mix of feedstocks, and so on. And we're looking, in the case of greenhouse gas emissions, we're using a social cost of carbon of $50 and $100 per metric ton of CO2, which are from the literature and are considered to be reasonable estimates of those damages. And then for the impacts of nitrogen, we are using estimates, a fairly extensive review of the estimates done by Sabota et al., a paper published in the Environmental Research Letters that provides a first sort of approximation really to possible range of benefits or damages due to these nitrogen emissions. And so those are summarized over here. We look at the impacts of 3 different levels: low, medium, and high costs of nitrogen damages. So just to get to the key findings, we find that compared to a no policy scenario, the demand for corn ethanol would increase corn acreage, and more importantly, there'd be a shift towards continuous corn rotations as opposed to corn soybeans. Corn prices would go up by about 12%. Nitrogen use would go up by about the same amount. Emissions would decrease largely because there would be a reduction in gasoline consumption, and but due to higher fuel prices now, actually the gasoline consumption would go down a little more than just the amount of biofuel increase in energy equivalent terms. So there'd be a negative domestic fuel rebound effect. And overall emissions would go down a little bit, 2.8% or so. This is sort of cumulative over the entire time period that we're looking at. If we look at the effects compared to the cellulosic biofuel mandates, so just the additional 16 billion gallons compared to the scenario with the corn ethanol, you find about half of that would come from corn stover and the rest from energy crops. And because corn stover is relatively cheaper to produce. And this demand for corn stover actually induces a further shift towards continuous corn rotation. So that has the implication that continuous corn is more nitrogen intensive than corn soybeans, and therefore that increases nitrogen use. We also, based on the literature, assume that when you remove corn stover, you have to apply more nitrogen to replace the nitrogen that has been removed. So for both of those reasons, the total nitrogen use actually goes up by about 9%. And even though there is, some energy crops do not require much nitrogen, but on the other hand, most of these energy crops are grown largely on idle land in the southern part of the U.S., and they do not really displace nitrogen used by row crops in the Midwest, which is where most of the nitrogen is being applied. So as a result, we do not get as large of a nitrogen benefit, although the increase in nitrogen is less than with corn ethanol, but it's nevertheless positive. And emissions do go down now by about 4% compared to corn ethanol alone. So when we convert all of this to measures of social welfare, looking at economic surplus for consumers, producers in both the ag and the transportation sectors, And yeah, just a couple more slides, as well as the monetized values of these environmental costs for greenhouse gas emissions and nitrogen. We find that while the agricultural producers gain in both scenarios, the agricultural consumers and the fuel consumers and producers actually are worse off compared to the no policy scenario. And so overall, there is a net economic cost of $109 billion over this time period. So this is a discounted cost over 15 years. And with the corn and cellulosic mandate, the cellulosic component of that mandate, it's an additional, it's sort of $69 billion more. There is a benefit in terms of reduced greenhouse gas emissions, so that's a positive. But then the additional nitrogen applications result in a positive cost, which is fairly significant in the case of corn ethanol and large in the case of the cellulosic as well. So overall, there's a reduction in total social welfare of $191 billion in for the corn ethanol mandate, and an additional 47 by adding the cellulosic ethanol mandate. We did a bunch of different sensitivity analysis I won't go into, but across we looked at low and high costs of nitrogen and carbon, different assumptions. But for corn ethanol, no matter what we do, it's always negative and large, the net social welfare impact. In the case of the cellulosic mandate, we find that the shaded boxes here are the ones where the net impact is positive. And so if the social cost of carbon is really high, and if the social cost of nitrogen is low or medium, then there are scenarios where the cellulosic mandate by itself would lead to a net positive economic benefit after including the environmental impacts. And so overall, we find that the biofuel mandates, particularly the corn ethanol, continuing the biofuel mandates would impose significant costs on the U.S. even after considering these environmental benefits. This may not always be the case for cellulosic biofuel mandate. If the social cost of carbon is high, we also have a couple other scenarios where those costs could be negative, or could be negative. But more importantly, these mandates do create a trade-off between the gains to the agricultural producers, loss to the fuel and food consumers, and the fossil fuel producers. They reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but they can increase nitrogen emissions. These trade-offs are lower with the cellulosic mandate compared to the corn ethanol mandate. They'd also be lower if the oil prices were high, which unfortunately they're not, and if the demand for food crops was high, because then our exports would go up, and our terms of trade would improve. Also the social cost, if we really value the carbon reductions much more than just $50 a ton, and we have a low social cost of nitrogen, then these mandates could provide a net benefit. Of course, we have to take into account that in the long run, as the cost of producing cellulosic biofuels goes down, then of course these economic costs could also decrease. All right, so let me just sort of stop with that. One of the limitations of this study is that we do not have site-specific estimates of these nitrogen damages and the site-specific monetary value of those damages. So we're using a very crude benefit transfer approach to do this study, but this provides at least a first cut at comparing the benefits to carbon with the costs of nitrogen and putting them together. So stop with that. Thanks, Shruti.
Right, thank you so much. This was really insightful presentation, and a lot of new information to digest. Of course, we all might have some questions and clarifications that we can delve into once we are done with the presentation. So may I invite Dr. Scott Swinton for your presentation, please. Let's see.
Thank you, Shruti.
Okay. And you yeah.
Right, very good. Yeah, Madhu's presentation reminds me that, you know, one of the big lessons from environmental economics in the last 4 decades has been the efficiency of setting goals, but not the means to reach those goals. It's been the efficiency of an outcomes focus. And yet the Energy Independence and Security Act is a good example of a policy that targeted a specific means of reaching an energy independence and security. So as a little background, I got interested in cellulosic biofuels for the same reason as Shruti. I mean, just very excited by the possibilities for improved environmental outcomes by following a bioenergy route. Over the past 15, so a lot of the focus then is, so I was very interested in seeing what were the energy environment kind of trade-offs here. But this was all contingent on farmer or landowner adoption and planting of cellulosic bioenergy feedstocks. And as Madhu alluded to when she showed us the progress toward the second generation renewable fuel standards, cellulosic feedstocks basically have scarcely been produced. And indeed, some of the major processing companies are shutting down plants. They're going bankrupt. So what I'm going to do is a little recap of basically a 10-year journey of mine to see what would it take to get people to produce cellulosic bioenergy feedstocks. And so let's start by looking at components of a supply curve. So this is a very stylized version, but it's focused on some of the kinds of things that a decade plus of research have shown to be important. So at the very bottom here, we've got the direct costs on site. So when we think about, you know, planting switchgrass or miscanthus, those are the costs that we focus on. What does it cost? But of course, you know, the next piece is, well, what's the opportunity cost of moving the land out of its current use and into that use? And that's the focus of my talk today. In addition, there are the balance of production risks, revenue, you know, particularly pricing yield risks changes when landowners move to perennial cellulosic crops. Transport and storage become a big issue because bioenergy feedstocks are spatially very dispersed. And there are various other points too. But my focus today is going to be on opportunity cost of land. And it comes from I could have made it more than 5, but 5 studies primarily, well, and exclusively in Michigan and Wisconsin. And in general, they look at two possible sources of cellulosic feedstocks, either from dedicated energy crops, which could be grass crops like miscanthus or switchgrass, or they could be fast-growing tree crops like willow or poplar. An alternative to this is using residues from crops that farmers or foresters were already producing. So you have a byproduct. And implicitly what that means is that the main costs of production have been covered by the primary product, and the byproduct only has to pick up the additional costs of additional processing, storage, and transport. So I'm going to five studies. One is a model of profit maximizing regional biomass supply. Second we'll look at 3 different kinds of landowner surveys and then third, some qualitative research based on personal interviews. So first, this is a toy model compared to the BPAM model that Madhu talked about, but this is a positive math programming sub-regional supply model, a pair of paired models from southwestern Michigan and central Wisconsin. So what's driving opportunity cost here? Well, these are models of agricultural production with the objective of profit maximization. So they do not include other amenities. This is strictly about production for profitability, and it's strictly agricultural alternatives. So what drives opportunity costs are yields and uses, alternative uses of the crop. So in Michigan, corn yields are low. There's relatively less dairy than in Wisconsin. So you have higher potential for cellulosic energy crops than in Wisconsin, where higher corn yields make the opportunity cost of corn production higher. And in addition, there's a very attractive alternative use for stover, which is to turn it into silage to feed dairy cattle. So this has repercussions for the supply available in a regional supply model. So what drives supply in the model I'm going to show you is the price ratio of the price of biomass to corn. And so we sequentially raise the biomass price. This is on the horizontal axis. So this is rising biomass to corn, biomass to corn grain price ratio. So first lesson is looking at switchgrass. As the price of biomass gets higher, you begin to see switchgrass production appear in Michigan, displacing annual crops like corn, soybeans, and wheat. Switchgrass is more productive, has higher yields per acre than mixed grasses. So those come in at a later point, at a higher price point. And they actually come in earlier in Wisconsin, partly because of the dairy. So two other alternatives. These are both byproducts, corn stover and wheat straw, and the horizontal axes are identical in these to what you saw on the other slide. So what you'll notice here is that corn stover comes in to the, as a profitable crop to be produced at significantly lower prices than either of the perennial crops. And it comes in earlier in Michigan than in Wisconsin because the opportunity cost is lower in Michigan, yields are lower. And similar story with wheat straw. So let's move now to, so that's a story of opportunity costs that's driven by alternative crops and the displacement of annual crops in existing cropping systems. And what I didn't put on those slides is where the current price of relative prices of biomass to feedstock to grain prices are, but those are well below the minimums for corn stover to come in to production, let alone the others. I mean, we're seeing a little bit with corn stover, but not a lot. So now let me move away from the stylized world of assuming profit maximizing behavior to talking, to using surveys of real people to ask them what their goals are and how they make choices. So these are now 3 surveys that look at landowner willingness to rent land for the purposes of bioenergy production. So surveys in Michigan in 2 years and in Wisconsin in 1 year. So now what we have is we have the same opportunity cost drivers as before in the sense of lower corn yields in Michigan, which will make people more willing to rent land out for bioenergy crop production, versus higher dairy, silage, and corn yields in Wisconsin. In these studies, we used land rental rate as a proxy for opportunity cost. So it was basically a contingent valuation willingness to accept format that presented people with potential land rental rates and asked them, would you be willing to rent out land for the following purpose at this price per acre? So here's what we get. The bottom axis, so this is more of a classic supply curve with price on the vertical axis, price in the form of land rent. And on the horizontal axis, we have quantity. This is quantity of land, and it's scaled so that the quantity is the percentage of farmable land in the study area. And this is what we use to allow us to compare studies that had come out of surveys in different places with different areas of land. The message here is that even when we go up to land rental rates that are double what were prevailing land rental rates at the time, although I'm sure low rental rates compared to Illinois, what we see is that fewer than 25% of the land was, landowners were willing to put less than 25% of the land into any of these systems, and particularly much less in Wisconsin, where opportunity costs are highest. Okay, so if it's very, very hard to get landowners to switch to dedicated cellulosic energy crops, which mean giving up the flexibility annually of changing annual crops and making a long-term commitment, what about residues? Residues avoid the opportunity cost of land use change. And as I mentioned before, the cost of production is primarily picked up by the main product. So the residues are only have to cover the marginal cost of harvest, storage, and transport. So let's look at two here. Corn stover, which is the most important bioenergy feedstock in the United States, but also logging residues, because there's a tremendous amount of timber production in the US, and most of the logging residues are left on the ground. So in my part of the country, there's a lot of logging that is done in the northern Great Lakes, northern Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And so we looked here at landowner willingness to allow timber residues to be collected and shipped off of the land. So this is at timber harvest. The land was going to be, these forests were going to be harvested anyway. So what is the willingness of the owner to allow removal of residues? And we're only looking at 50% removal of residues because we wanted to make sure to be sustainable in the sense of leaving adequate organic matter. So costs are for on-site gathering, chipping, on-site, and then transport by road to a demand point. And the map you see here is of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The city of Escanaba has historically been an important, it's an important point for paper production. And a lot of paper production actually uses wood chips to burn to provide the energy. So looking at three different kinds of landowners, commercial, large companies, small-scale, non-industrial private forests, then state and public, state forests, and national forests. What we got was, first, nobody produces at less than $50 per oven-dried ton, because you can't cover the on-site costs at lower prices. From there, the cost rises according to the cost of transport, and federal forests are not willing to play ball at all. State forests to a very limited amount. The biggest supply is coming from the private large companies. So, key conclusions here. Opportunity costs of land are partly through income earning alternatives, although in the case of private landowners and public forests, there's also an important opportunity cost from amenity generation. And we've seen this with private owners of agricultural lands as well. Finally, there are legal restrictions and option values that add to the opportunity cost. So the upshot is that there is the feedstock supply in lots of studies that look at biophysical availability. It looks like there's a massive feedstock supply in the United States. But then when you move from the biophysical availability to techno-economic models, you find that there's less available. But the techno-economic models are still assuming that all landowners are willing. Once you move to looking at landowners, you find that there's less available yet. And what we haven't done is to do a revealed preference of who actually plays ball. But the fact that so few landowners actually make cellulosic feedstocks available is a signal to me that the revealed preference is even less than the stated preferences in surveys. So thank you very much. That's my story.
Thank you so much. This was a very good presentation, and I got to learn a lot. Thank you for sharing your decade worth of work with us, Scott. So now let's go to Dr. Juan Cisneros' presentation, and we will get back to you with our questions, Scott, in a bit. Let's see here. Juan, you're ready to go? Let me start the time. Okay.
There you go. Can everybody see my slides as a slideshow?
Yes.
Great. Well, those were fantastic presentations, really, and complementary in many, many ways. I thought, at the risk of putting words in Madhu's and Scott's mouths here, and also at the risk of oversimplifying, let me say this. I mean, in a sense, what Madhu was looking at, or her research was looking at, is let's assume that we do enforce the mandate, and that this thing will happen. What are the efficiency implications of that? Of course, for that to happen, as Madhu pointed out, we have to have, if we're going to comply with the cellulosic biofuel mandate, we have to have some kind of mix. And Madhu showed an interesting 53% stover, 47% energy dedicated crop mix as a result of the model. And then Scott put a big, cautionary message on that, saying, it's going to be, we can get there if you offer a high enough price, but it's probably going to be a really, really high price to induce these suppliers to actually do it. I'm going to try to, and of course, a big component of Scott's story was opportunity cost. If you actually try to induce these farmers to move from really profitable annual crops to something else, it's going to be really expensive for you to do it, and even then, a lot of farmers may not even be willing to do it. So what my research tries to, in a sense, do is try to reconcile those two things, and maybe try to find a way to say, if we're going to steal land from corn, it's going to be really hard. So how about we try something else, and we look at idle land or marginal land as a possibility, which Madhu also alluded to during her presentation. So this research in collaboration with Nate Trull, Ben Gramick, and my former student Tanner McCarty kind of looks at that and puts a magnifying glass on a single plant that is trying to procure enough biomass to fill capacity, so a biorefinery. And it looks at a situation where you can procure crop residues, and you can also procure an energy dedicated crop. We put our attention on switchgrass, mostly grown from marginal land or idle land. And so we know that the mix of feedstocks that you're going to use in a biorefinery will certainly influence both the cost and the environmental footprint of that bioenergy production. And in the literature, as Scott alluded to, energy dedicated crops are typically not found competitive unless, as also Madhu alluded to, you pay enough to make that happen. So what we're going to try to make a compelling case for here is that you know, in most of the literature, the previous literature, there's an assumption that feedstocks, different sources of feedstock for bioenergy production are assumed substitutes, both upstream and downstream. So upstream, we're going to have to move away from, say, corn and corn stover to actually put some switchgrass in there, and that's very expensive to do. So there's a competition for land. Then downstream is at the biorefinery level. Most analysis assume that the biorefinery can only process one feedstock. And what we're going to try to make a case for here is that actually that's kind of at odds with many situations. We do have idle land or marginal land where these two things do not have to compete for the same land sources, but also a lot of currently operating biorefineries can actually process more than one feedstock at the same time, so they can accommodate multiple feedstock. So then the main contribution of this study is take those assumptions that we think at least at the micro level at odds with features of current markets, and develop a framework that can relax them. So in a sense, what we're doing is to model a firm's pricing of multiple feedstocks in a spatial landscape. And I'll go in a minute to why we need to actually implement a spatial landscape here. But the main findings, so this is of course the main take-home message. So this is big spoiler alert here, is that first of all, the conventional wisdom that energy dedicated crops can really not compete with, say, stover or corn residues could unravel once you include once you relax these two assumptions, and that can actually help improve the environmental footprint of bioenergy. So let me now go to the details of this body of work. So again, a big part of the literature established that the inclusion of energy dedicated crops in the mix of feedstocks can both enhance the environmental footprint of cellulosic bioenergy, but also ease the trade-off between food and energy or food and bioenergy if grown in marginal land. Of course, EDCs are costlier, and by EDC, I mean, of course, energy dedicated crops are costlier to produce than crop residues, but production cost is only a part of the procurement cost. Then there's transportation costs, and you know, multiple studies, like for example, Thompson and Tyner, have shown that it can, depending on the distance traveled, it can actually be all the way up to 40% of total procurement costs. So certainly transportation costs a large portion of this. So we're focusing on corn stover versus switchgrass. If you have spatial limitations on corn planting density and constraints on stover removal, that means that if a biorefinery will procure, will fill capacity exclusively with corn stover, it might have to travel really long distances to get enough. You'll see here that my assumptions are actually pretty favorable to stover. I'm kind of trying to stack the deck against energy dedicated crops to raise the question, can they actually happen, even under unfavorable conditions? So if you combine this potentially high distance travel by the biorefinery to procure enough biomass with high transportation costs, what you have is a really large procurement cost. So the question is, can you avoid that transportation cost by actually procuring energy dedicated crops that are grown in proximity to the plant? Now, what previous studies did is they had two assumptions. One is that EDCs have to compete with row crops for land. When you have that kind of assumption, you're kind of ruling out the transportation cost avoidance role of energy dedicated crops, because now even if you try to procure EDCs from a location that it's in proximity to the plant, you're going to have to pay the farmer to convince them to switch away from corn and towards EDC, which is very expensive to do. So that assumption in and of itself sort of kills the economics of EDC. But say that you can still plant EDC in marginal land, so you don't have to induce the farmer to go away from row crops and grow EDCs. You're going to have to cover some opportunity costs, of course, but not the opportunity costs of productive corn land. You can still kind of assume away the economics of EDC by just assuming that the plant can't process both EDC and stover. So in that case, now you have a plant that either procures exclusively EDCs from marginal land or stover from everywhere. And in that case, of course, the economics of EDC are just not there, right? So it's at the end of the day, it's much cheaper to procure enough stover than to procure EDC. So what we claim here is that assumptions 1 or 2 kind of rule out the transportation cost avoidance role of EDCs. So why do we say that assumptions 1 and 2 are kind of at odds with features of empirical markets? There's actually plenty of sources where the biorefineries routinely state that they can process multiple feedstocks. If you go to the biorefineries' websites, actually they're claiming that they are using multiple feedstocks. As Scott mentioned, some of those are not either no longer operating or are operating for a different market. But they do claim that their technology can actually process multiple feedstocks, and that their regional plan, when they built the plan, was to use multiple feedstocks. So certainly the technology seems to be there. And also there seems to be a significant amount of marginal land or idle land where EDCs can, if demanded, be grown. And in fact, it's more likely that if they are grown at all, they're going to be grown in marginal land. Precisely because of the reasons that Scott just alluded to, just profitability of row crops, insurance subsidies supporting them. A lot of challenges, something that hasn't been mentioned before, but actually Madhu has worked on a lot of the challenges involved in contracting for energy crops as well. That makes it a little bit harder to induce the farmer, to go from corn to energy dedicated crops. So because of that, we think biorefineries are ready, technologically speaking anyway, to process more than one feedstock type. And also, if energy dedicated crops are demanded, they're probably going to be grown in marginal land and not compete for the same pieces of land as corn. So what we try to do here in this body of work is to develop an empirical framework capturing 3 key features of these procurement markets: high transportation costs, multi-feedstock technologies on the biorefinery side, and then availability of marginal land. And so our question was, when you combine these 3, is there a role for energy dedicated crops as part of the cost minimizing feedstock mix of a biorefinery? So it's a bit challenging to do that in a sense. Because we have to extend the canonical Hotelling's linear market model to accommodate multiple feedstocks. I won't talk about the technicalities too much. I'll just mention some of those later on. And then lack of observational data, of course. So we have to combine historical data on land use from NAS with crop simulation models. We use the Comet Farm to compute some environmental, actually carbon footprints for different options, sort of baseline and counterfactual, and farm level data to calibrate our model. So we calibrate to growing and procurement conditions in 2 counties in Indiana. And again, as I said, the question that we're trying to raise is not really to predict whether energy dedicated crops will be part of the mix, but rather to raise the question, can they be part of the mix at all, even under relatively unfavorable conditions? So we're in an area of Indiana with really high corn planting density, which tends to favor stover. And we also assume a really high removal rate of stover of 75%. So again, we're kind of stacking the deck against energy dedicated crops to see if even then they can survive. Again, this is the only thing that I'm going to mention about the model. I don't want to run out of time here. But if you think about two potential feedstocks, stover and switchgrass, there's multiple procurement scenarios that you can observe endogenously in the model. So first, the plant decides to fill capacity with stover only, right? And when I say unconfined, what I'm trying to say is the procurement region may be confined, and we have multiple discussions of this in the papers, but the procurement region may be confined by regulation, competition, just simply planting density. And so we play with procurement areas of different size. So in some cases you can have where the plant only fills capacity with stover, and the market is unconfined. So the market is bigger than the area I need to fill capacity with stover. Then you can have stover confined, which is still the plant is filling capacity only with stover, but within a confined procurement region, which means the role of the intensive margin will be a little higher and more important as opposed to the extensive margin. Then, of course, you can have switchgrass only confined, switchgrass unconfined, stover unconfined, switchgrass unconfined. So all possible combinations of both feedstocks with a confined or unconfined procurement market. So in these cases, what you see on the right here, single feedstock FOB pricing. So those are the pricing strategies that a cost minimizing plant follows in each one of those scenarios. So what we do is we actually solve for a vector parameters. We solve for each one of these possible pricing scenarios and then compute the cost. And we choose the one that minimizes cost. So then as you change the parameters, you're gonna see different scenarios popping up. That is the corresponds to the cost minimizing pricing strategy. An interesting thing here is as scenarios 5, 6, 7, and 8, which are incidentally the scenarios that will endogenously emerge as cost minimizing, is that 5 and 6 require an equi-marginal pricing principle where the marginal cost of procuring stover is equal to the marginal cost of procuring energy dedicated crops. And in 7 and 8, you end up with a hierarchical pricing strategy. So those are some of the sort of byproducts of developing this framework. So I'm going to show some of the results here. What you see again is this on the x-axis of this. Yes, thank you. The x-axis of this figure is the size of the procurement region, and on the y-axis, the marginal cost of procuring a megagram of either stover or switchgrass. So as you can see, if the procurement region is 160 kilometers of length, you're going to have the equi-marginal principle all the way from 160 to 66 or 67, I think it is. So what happens is between 120 and 160, you're going to have an unconfined switchgrass procurement and then an unconfined stover procurement. So the procurement region is big enough so that we're procuring both without the procurement region actually being binding in terms of size. So we're procuring a lot from the extensive margin relative to the intensive margin. So what this says is that there will be procurement of switchgrass in the cost minimizing mix, even if the stover market is unconfined. And the reason is because if the plant only procures or fills capacity with stover, it has to travel a distance that is so long that it's better off procuring switchgrass from marginal land in close proximity to the plant. And in fact, I haven't included that figure here, but the optimal mix is about 80% stover, 20% switchgrass in these scenarios. As the procurement region gets smaller and smaller and smaller, again, due to competition or regulation or simply planting patterns, what happens is the marginal cost of procurement goes up a little bit, particularly below 120 up to 67. That's because now the market for stover is confined, which means we need to procure more. The plant to fill capacity needs to procure more from the intensive margin, which means higher prices offered to corn farmers to switch to corn and remove the stover. When the procurement region is very, very small, you see this bifurcation between stover price and switchgrass price. And the reason is that's the hierarchical pricing strategy. The reason is we can still procure enough stover to fill capacity from the intensive margin at that point, but there's no intensive margin for switchgrass because you only have a certain amount of marginal land available. So from that point on, you procure as much switchgrass as you possibly can with the available marginal land, but then the rest you have to procure from the intensive margin from stovers. So you have to offer a really, really high price of stovers. So in a sense, that left scenario parallels Scott's concerns that when there's a big limitation on the supply of energy dedicated crops, then you really have to just go with stover and it becomes very expensive. So I'm going to try to show you a couple of things here. The discontinuous gray line shows on the right axis here the savings associated with including energy dedicated crops in the mix relative to a baseline where only stover is being procured. So the plant fills capacity with stover only. So what you see here is that if the procurement region is say 80 kilometers, there's a 1.5 cents per liter, so that will be about 6 cents per gallon of ethanol in cost savings from using a mix of feedstocks as opposed to stover only. So clearly there are some significant savings from including energy dedicated crops on the mix, which points to some economic attractiveness of energy dedicated crops in these cases. This again only shows that so what we have is a baseline here of stover only versus the cost minimizing scenario of the feedstock mix. And so these are net emissions of the stover only scenario. I'm only gonna focus on two here. And then this discontinued gray dashed line here is with the optimal mix. So what this is showing is that the carbon footprint of bioenergy production is much lower with the mix than it is with stover only, assuming that the plant will fill capacity with stover only. Okay, so this is for farm surplus. I'm not going to go into that in the interest of time and to also allow for some discussion later. But the conclusions here is that if cellulosic biorefineries enter the market, say, for example, as Madhu argued, because we do in fact enforce a cellulosic biofuel mandate, then feedstock diversification is likely to occur as long as we recognize first that they're probably going to be coming from marginal land and not competing for land with corn. And second, that the technologies are there so that that the biorefinery can process multiple feedstocks at the same time. And actually, the feedstock diversification will lead to reduced carbon footprint and maybe water pollution, although that's something that I haven't really quantified here. So a confined procurement region, again, for example, if you take Madhu's scenario where the demand for cellulosic biofuel is so big that procurement regions among plants are likely to overlap, and there's going to be competition, and there's going to put some confinement in procurement regions that could lead to even more participation of energy dedicated crops. And finally, our framework, the one that we developed here, could be applied to many other situations, like for example, sorghum and corn in the USA, a paper just published by my advisor, Dick Perrin, in Nebraska, where he's looking at the economics of mixing up sorghum and corn in corn ethanol plants. Sugar cane and corn in Brazil, it's a debate that has long been had by a lot of specialists there, and also different sources of biomass in CHP systems or power generation. So our framework can apply to all of those, and I think that's a good byproduct of this body of research. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Juan. In addition to what Madhu and Scott explained, your approach included both the upstream and downstream, which is very important. In my presentation, after hearing all of these talks, what it alludes to is incentivizing this bioenergy crop production in those locations with marginal leafy condition, where low input perennial crops can provide net negative emissions and economic benefits, will be very crucial in building a successful bioeconomy. And we talked about a number of ecosystem services that bioenergy, like cellulosic bioenergy crops could generate, such as water quality improvement, biodiversity increase, and soil carbon sequestration, etc. Right? And the purpose of my work is to generate this spatially explicit information on first the location where the compensation for carbon sequestration, for example, can change the profitability of those marginal land plots when converted to switchgrass from corn soil. And second, the estimated profits from switchgrass cultivation. So I would like to just go very quickly because we want to have some discussion. So this is the integrated assessment framework that couples both biophysical model and economic analysis. And we use this descent model, which uses these climate variables, land use, land cover variables, topography, soil, to estimate the corn switchgrass biomass production at a resolution of 4 kilometers and potential soil carbon sequestration from switchgrass. And then we used that in production function model to identify the profitable land for converting land from corn soil to switchgrass. So this is the result of descent model, where we can see the spatial variability in biomass yield and carbon sequestration. And so here you can see the distribution of marginal land in Illinois and economically viable plots in blue under different scenarios of switchgrass biomass yield and compensation for soil carbon sequestration at anywhere from no compensation to $80 per metric ton of CO2 equivalent. And then we aggregated those areas of marginal land where we have these economically viable plots and those counties where the total profit exceeds $100,000. And this can help doing more rigorous work with this downstream work that Juan you just mentioned earlier. And we see that all those land which are not economically viable to convert from corn soy to switchgrass can be converted to switchgrass, and we can still get a profit 20% higher than corn and soy in several spots when we introduce this carbon sequestration, like compensation for carbon sequestration. And this is only one of the ecosystem services that we talked about. And there are a number of other ecosystem services like pollination and water quality improvement, and all, the spatial variability in the environmental characteristics of this land. When we take into account that information and then combine it with the production cost, revenues, and different level of compensation for carbon, I think that gives some advantage, like where farmers could be compensated, and with that compensation, whether the willingness for switching their land to switchgrass crop increases or not. So this is the summary of the result of that work. And we estimated that with a compensation of soil carbon sequestration at the rate of $40 to $80 per metric ton, the area of economically viable area to convert into switchgrass crop can increase by 140% to all the way to 414% as compared to no compensation for carbon sequestered, right? And this is one of the estimates, and there are a lot of caveats, and even the definition of marginal land varies, right? But with USDA's estimation on marginal land in Illinois, 1.6 million hectare of marginal land, if we convert that land to switchgrass cultivation for 10 years, we will be able to generate about 1 to 1.8 million metric ton of switchgrass biomass, and also support climate change mitigation by sequestering carbon in soil, and that ranges from 5 to 22 million metric ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. I think we still have 15 more minutes for discussion, so I would like to open the floor for discussion at this time. And if you have questions, please go ahead.
So maybe let me start. Thanks, Shruti. I think that brings it full circle to so across all of our talks, I think one of the kind of common issues is that is looking at the role that marginal land can play, and I guess just and sort of underlying that is really an assessment of what is the right way to measure the cost of using marginal land, and which is as hard a question as knowing how much marginal land there is, because that itself is very controversial. But on this question of what is the cost of using marginal land, I think if I understood from your approach, I know in our approach, probably what Yuan is doing, we're essentially assuming that these lands, their alternative use is really for farming and for producing corn and soybeans, or whichever field crop. And the fact that they're not, if they're idle, it's because so anyway, I mean, in our model, what we're assuming is that the reason that this land is idle and not producing corn and soybeans is because the cost of converting it to produce corn and soybeans is much higher than the profits they could get with corn and soybeans. So they're low productive, and we're, and that's sort of consistent with farmers' profit maximization behavior. That's they're going to use this land to maximize their returns. Whether or not that is the case is, of course, we do not know. That's an assumption. That's based on the assumption of profit maximization. And I think what Scott's work shows is that perhaps that's not necessarily the case everywhere, at least, because this land might have other alternatives. I mean, and amenities, and there would be other reasons why landowners may want to keep their land open. They like open space and so on. So really, I think at the heart of all of this is trying to get a better understanding of how, what is the cost of converting marginal land to energy crops. And I think that's a question that, Scott has addressed it head on, and it's there for Michigan. I wonder, Scott, your sense of whether that is, how that might apply to other places in the country, or is that something that you think is specific to the Michigan and Wisconsin landowners?
Oh, no, I mean, so I actually on the side sent a GCB bioenergy article we wrote to Juan, because in my kind of hasty running through some of these studies, one of the studies that we did asked owners, so we did a area frame sample of people who owned at least 10 acres of non-crop marginal land. So this was about 6 or 7 years ago, because, you know, there's all this focus on, let's do the marginal lands. And so we asked real people how they felt about that. And first off, when you ask people if they're about their willingness to rent land out for bioenergy crops, either perennial or annual corn, the first thing they wanted to do was rent existing agricultural land. They didn't, you know, the great majority preferred not to change their marginal lands. Why? So we didn't dig in on that, but I think this is, you know, many of them use those lands for hunting, for hiking, for bird habitat. So it's marginal from the standpoint of an agricultural profit maximization model, but it's not marginal from the standpoint of people who live near the land and enjoy its uses. And so, and there was a sociological element too that we did not dig into, but a number of people said, well, I've inherited this land from my grandfather, and he said, you should never use that wetland area for crops. So we've never put it there, and I wouldn't want to, because for family reasons, we've been told not to. So anyway, I think that this is, although the research I've done was in my state, I think that the lessons are very extrapolable, but the details will be different in different places. You know, I look at Shruti's map of marginal land in Illinois, and I think, wow, an acre of marginal land in Illinois is like some of the best land we've got in Michigan.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for shedding some lights on that aspect. Yeah, as Madhu rightly pointed out, you know, all these are based on so many assumptions, and one more assumption is, you know, when we plant switchgrass, supposedly like a native grass, it still provides habitat to pheasants and deers, and you know, even supports to some extent the pollinators, and also, yeah, that's what I have been, you know, I think
doesn't
it is
blossom.
Yeah, it just looks like one stop to go, but you know, it is important to actually collect more information on, like, have some observational data on switchgrass field, whether that really happens, right? And with, like, how much carbon is sequestered. Maybe it is important to just do the soil sampling and figure that out, and how much nitrate gets nitrates and sediment loss reduction can we achieve through these
So
grass crops.
I think this is a very useful discussion. I think Madhu raised a very good question, and Scott has a very compelling answer to it. I wonder, again, like Madhu did, about the robustness of this answer, not only in terms of geographical heterogeneity, but also there's quite a bit of evidence from, say, the solar panel adoption literature, that the type of contract you offer, not just a fixed payment, but combinations of payments of different nature, can actually substantially affect people's willingness to accept, to adopt something. Madhu has done a little bit of that in terms of how contract attributes, or what are people's preferences in terms of contract attributes. I wonder how robust the unwillingness of farmers to grow energy dedicated crops are to different contract structures that biorefiners are likely to offer. That's a big thing in terms of, I mean, these things are going to be traded through contracts. There's no way that they're going to be traded in an open market. So then the characteristics of those contracts could really matter. But either way, I mean, the other point is, even if you know what their willingness to accept is, whatever that is, and however robust that is to different contract attributes, geographic heterogeneities, but also how much of the alternative you have available. So say stover, right? So if in our case, we were assuming a huge removal rate. So if that removal rate is constrained by either regulation or whatever it is, then that should push an existing processing plant to offer more for the other stuff. And I wonder whether that could push willingness to pay just above willingness to accept. That's a different part of the same question, but you know, one that certainly interests me anyway.
Yeah, I think it also really comes down to, you know, how I think even though we're also talking about marginal land, I think there's lots of differences and subtle differences in the type of land that we're talking about. I mean, and you know, when I'm thinking of marginal land, I'm thinking of land which is really, you know, being used for crop production, but kind of idle because there isn't enough demand. It's not profitable for crop production. Scott is talking about marginal land that is being used for other amenities and provides those amenities, which in Illinois, we do not know across the country how much of that land is really in those types of uses. And so that's sort of one issue over here. You know, and I agree with you. I mean, I think the kind of contract that's provided makes a huge difference, at least from our survey. You know, because farmers are there's multiple things that they're trying to balance. So it's not just a question of, you know, what price are you willing to provide it, but really what, you know, are these long-term contracts, what does that mean for the riskiness of the return, and it depends on the risk preferences of the farmers. So it's a more complicated question. That's another aspect that, you know, I think needs to be considered. I guess just want to add one more last thought to this, which is that, you know, I mean, we know that land has actually been leaving agriculture and over the last many decades, and so and becoming idle, and it's either moving into urban land or it's got to have some other uses, but it is leaving agriculture. And so, you know, that's, if you're looking out to the next 10 or 15 years and we see this land has got, you know, is going to become idle over time, you know, then there's a question of what is the, you know, what happens if there is an alternative use for it, and that is bioenergy crops. Would farmers be willing to convert land that was previously in crop production and is now going to become idle and maybe used for another crop? So that's another way of looking at what might happen in the future, which may not be dependent on just what is the current situation with land that is already, you know, available and in some other non-crop use.
Right. And also, you know, in terms of how, Scott also mentioned here, he wrote one question here about congressional initiative to pay farmers for carbon sequestration. Even at the other levels like ES, Ecosystem Service Market Consortium, and NORI Carbon Market, those organizations are trying to figure out a way to compensate farmers for carbon sequestration. And we also heard from Nestle USA during this AEA seminar, and you know, there are several other Danone and General Mills who are willing to pay farmers for carbon credits. So if we can bring these different components together, maybe you know, we can figure out a way to compensate farmers for either just leaving the land idle, the marginal land as it is, and sequestering carbon and not converting it into net positive greenhouse gas emission crops, or you know, convert those into these switchgrass or other bioenergy crops, which can sequester more carbon. And maybe like other ecosystem services as well.
Yeah, though, you know, there's some new research coming out of Iowa and a couple of other places about the advantages of prairie plantings. And there, with mixed species that includes forbs as well as grasses, you get a much wider range of ecosystem services, although you get less of like carbon sequestration solo, which is done really well by fast growing perennial grasses.
Right. Yeah, maybe that is another research, another avenue we could look at going further, like what are the possibilities for stacking all these ecosystem services values, and which organizations we need to bring together to initiate or facilitate some sort of payment for ecosystem services farmers generate.
Just to expand a little bit on the discussion, since we're talking about payments and we're talking about contracts too, in terms of the question of how different contract structures might affect farmers' willingness to accept to grow, I wrote a paper with Tannick McCarty that it's right now under review, where we did not survey farmers, but we modeled how different contract structures might affect willingness to accept. And so the idea there is that as actually Scott has modeled with Song and Zhang, if the farmer in fact faces sort of a real options situation because of the uncertainty and irreversibility of switching, from whatever the opportunity cost is, and I'm not saying it's row crops, we're talking about marginal land, whatever that opportunity cost is to energy dedicated crops. We try to model this, which is kind of interesting because now you have a plan that can offer 3 types of payments, which is like annual payments, establishment payment, and price per ton payment. And there are other contract terms that you can use too, like for example, indexing the energy dedicated crop to the opportunity cost, the price that you pay for the energy dedicated crop to the opportunity cost, whether corn or whatever the opportunity cost is, in a way to sort of shift rents and risk along the vertical supply chain. And what's kind of challenging with that is that now you have to, the plan offers a contract that has to satisfy an incentive compatibility constraint, and a participation constraint, I'm sorry, but the participation constraint is itself the solution to a real options problem. So even modeling this thing becomes really complicated very quickly. And one thing that I always wonder is, with Scott and his experience surveying people, is how do people think about this? Do their approach to it, can it really be modeled by this complicated models, or if not, what is kind of the rule of thumbs that they use, and what kind of adjustment we can do to our modeling strategies to try to approach actual behavior on the field as much as we possibly can.
If that's a question to me, I don't have a ready answer. What I will say is that the longer in the tooth that I get, the more interested I am in qualitative research about why real people do what they really do. Because there are a lot of objectives out there. There's a lot of imperfect rationality, and it's just messy.
I have yeah. Go ahead.
Please.
This is Rich Email from Auburn University. I have a quick question along this line of discussion. So you said, Scott, in your presentation, you mentioned farmers are very much hesitant to convert land to switchgrass or miscanthus, and you use surveys. So I'm not sure. So you mentioned the value amenity and values provided by those land. I'm not sure how those valuation is determined or affected by the fact there is very less or very less demand for the biomass they will produce. Like there are no not very many biorefineries there, so they can see. I'm wondering if they can see those demand, their evaluation of those amenity value might change, like because people are not very much rational. Yeah, that's my just question.
Yeah, well, we didn't ask them, we framed it as, would you be willing to rent your land out to someone else who would undertake all of the production activities under a 10-year contract. So the landowner didn't have to be worried about how they were going to market the product. That was all somebody else's problem, because we wanted to isolate the willingness to let the land be used for bioenergy crops. And we looked at annual corn, perennial switchgrass, and mixed perennial grasses and perennial poplar. So the inferences that we got from that about people's motives included amenities, but it was not exclusively amenities. I just alluded to that because what was so striking was that under a quarter of them were willing to make marginal lands available for bioenergy crops at double the prevailing rental rates in their agricultural land rental rates in their areas.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Scott. So it's 3:35 now. Are you guys willing to take one more question? Or do you have any question from the audience? Maybe you can take one last question. Or if not, I think this was really great discussion, and thank you so much for taking time to explain your decades of research with us. This is very, very valuable, and I would like to close this session. Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thank
thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for participating, everybody. Bye-bye now.